Jack Kerouac, writer, reluctant icon. The French presence in what is now the United States stretches back to the early days of the colonization of the continent, when the explorer Robert de La Salle and others traversed the then unexplored Great Lakes region and the Mississippi River, and the settlement of what is now Maine, then part of the colony of Acadia. Soon, Missouri and Louisiana followed, becoming colonies of the vast and powerful French Empire. Hundreds of Frenchmen and women flocked to the New World to begin new lives away from the slums of Paris or Orleans, to give their future generations lands of their own, not owned by rich lords, but by them and them alone. Out of all the colonies France owned, the greatest was its namesake, New France, situated in what is now the Canadian province of Quebec. Founded by Samuel de Champlain in 1610, New France soon grew into a prosperous and thriving colony of the French crown, its people developing their own distinct cultural identity. These people, becoming known as Canadiens or Canadians, became major players in the coming century, when France and Britain, rivals since the medieval period, fought war after bloody war for control of the continent. From New York to Quebec to the shores of Isle St. John, modern-day Prince Edward Island, the two global powers waged countless battles and uprooted many families, both British and French. It was during these colonial wars that the first French Canadians found their way to America, either voluntarily or being captured, either by British soldiers or their Native American allies, the Iroquois Confederacy. Then, in 1776, when the 13 colonies joined together and revolted against the British Crown, creating the United States of America, they sent an invading army into Quebec with the hopes of converting the French Canadians to their cause. Leading the charge in this was Benjamin Franklin, who wrote letters prior to the invasion, urging the French Canadian people to rise up against their British overlords, who only 13 years before had won control of New France after the conclusion of the 7 Years' War, the final large-scale conflict between France and Great Britain to determine the fates of their respective colonies. Some French Canadians, such as Pierre Ayot, Philippe Liebert, and Clement Gosselin, answered Franklin's call and took up arms with the revolutionary forces, joining in their attacks on Montreal and Quebec City. But by and large, the populace of the province, while not lovers of the British, were thankful that they respected their Roman Catholic faith and traditions and allowed them to keep them, whereas the Americans, many of whom were hardline Protestants, would not be so open-minded and kind towards papists. Therefore, only a handful of French Canadians fought for the cause of American independence, and after the war ended and the United States was officially recognized in 1784, they received land grants in the newly founded states, sowing the seeds for new generations of French Canadian Americans. While these soldiers, and those who preceded them, were the first French Canadians in America, they were small in number, and many assimilated into American society quickly or over a few generations. It was not until the middle and late 1800s, when there was a massive influx of Canadian immigration, both of Anglophone and Francophone, that large communities of French Canadians began popping up in New England and other U.S. states. Many of these found work in the lumber mills and logging camps, doing the hard, back-breaking labor of cutting or hauling logs, working in dangerous conditions alongside Scottish, Scots-Irish, and Native Irish immigrants. While rubbing elbows and forming friendships with their fellow immigrants, the French Canadians, called Canucks by many Americans, both as a term of endearment and an ethnic slur, kept their language and culture alive in their communities, called Little Canadas, scattered throughout New England, including in Lowell, Massachusetts, a city which is vital to this story. America offered a chance for a better life for many Quebec families, but it also gave them things they would have been better off without, such as prejudice and bigotry, both for being predominantly Catholic and for their French heritage. Several different slurs came into use to describe the French Canadians in these years, such as pea soapers, referring to their habit of eating pea soup often, frogs, coon-asses, greasers, and of course papists. The insults and hatred didn't just come from the dominant English society either, but from other minority communities, and in turn, as unfortunate as it is, the French Canadians held prejudices against other groups. Despite the difficulties and the bigotry they faced, the French Canadians and their English-speaking Canadian cousins made new lives for themselves in the U.S., establishing successful businesses, families, and neighborhoods. One of the families who migrated from Canada to the New England region of the United States during these years was the Kerouac clan, headed by their patriarch Jean-Baptiste Kerouac and his wife Marie Clementine Bernier, both from long-established French-Canadian families in Quebec. According to family tradition handed down to Jack from his father Leo, one of the sons of Jean-Baptiste and Marie Clementine, the Kerouacs traced their ancestry back to Brittany, France, and before that to Cornwall, and ultimately to Ireland, where they had been nobility. A strong believer in his Celtic blood, Jack once commented that it was partially from this side of his family that he received the gift of storytelling and took great pride in his ancestry. How much of this oral account of his family is true is up to each individual reader to decide. But for my part, knowing how oral traditions can last many generations and many centuries, I do believe it. The earliest ancestor of Jack's that can be determined with any certainty is Alexandre Louis de Libris de Kerouac, a minor baron from Brittany who received land grants in Quebec from the king and settled there in the 1730s. Once in Quebec, Alexandre's descendants, including Jack's line, married women of the Mohawk tribe, becoming potato farmers and business owners, settling seamlessly into French-Canadian life. By the time the 19th century rolled around, the Kerouacs, having long lost their nobility status, were common French-Canadian peasants trying to eke out a living in their province, struggling like most to make ends meet and yearning for a better life. Jean-Baptiste Kerouac, seeing the steady stream of his countrymen crossing into the U.S., decided his own family's future would be better on the other side of the border, and in 1890, a year after Jack's father, Leo Alcide Kerouac, was born, the family moved to New Hampshire, where Jean-Baptiste found work as a carpenter in the town of Nashua. It was in their new home that their surname changed from Kerouac to the familiar Kerouac. Jack's mother's side, the Levaiques, originally came from Normandy, descending from Robert Levaique, who immigrated from Normandy to Quebec in 1674 as a carpenter, and like the Kerouacs, the Levaiques soon became well established in Quebec society. Jack's mother, Gabrielle Ange Levaique, was born in 1893 in Saint-Facon, Quebec. Like Leo's, her family joined the migration to the U.S. soon after her birth, and she would grow up in a little Canada in New Hampshire, where she and Leo spoke French as their first language, kept their ethnic identity strong, and in Gabrielle's case, stayed involved with the Catholic Church throughout childhood right up into adulthood. As a young woman in 1913, Gabrielle moved to Nashua, where she took up work at odd jobs and working in factories, earning her way on her own and slowly integrating into the French-Canadian community there. Even at such a young age, she was 20, she was more mature than many of her contemporaries, noted for being serious, thrifty with money, wearing simple clothing, and devoutly Catholic. At the same time, Leo was working a printer's apprentice in the city, writing articles and learning how to use the typeset and how to bind pages, and it is while learning the printing craft that he met Gabrielle, and the two hit it off, courting for the next 2 years before marrying in St. Aloysius of Gonzaga Church, the Catholic church founded by the French Canadians of Nashua in 1871. Not long after their marriage, the newlyweds left Nashua and headed to Massachusetts, where they settled down to raise a family in Lowell, finding a place in its French-Canadian enclave. The Kerouacs welcomed their first child, François Gerard Kerouac, 2 years after settling in Lowell, on August 23, 1916. Gerard, as he was known in the family, was from the start a sickly child, prone to illnesses and long stretches in bed, nursed by Gabrielle and at times by Leo. Like his mother, Gerard, as much as his young mind was able to comprehend such things, became a devout Catholic, relying on his faith to help deal with his various health problems. After Gerard, Leo and Gabrielle had a second child, a daughter, 2 years later, on October 25, 1918, whom they named Gabrielle Caroline, though her nickname throughout her life would be Nim. And finally, several years later, on March 12, 1922, the Kerouacs welcomed their third and final child, a baby boy they named Jean-Louis de Libris Kerouac. To his family, he would forever be known as T. Jean, Little John, but to the outside world, in time, he would become known as Jean Kerouac, and then later still Jack Kerouac. The Kerouacs lived on 34 Beaulieu Street in the French-Canadian quarter of the city, surrounded by other immigrant neighborhoods filled with Irish, Poles, and Greeks, all of which, while some prejudice existed, as is usually the case in any place, got along well together. One Greek family, the Sampas, would come to play a prominent role in Jack's later life. Leo, having completed his apprenticeship, started up his own printing business and rented out a shop in the city where he printed flyers for local businesses and continued to write his own articles. At home, the Kerouacs spoke only French, English being the language of outside, used only when necessary. As a consequence, Jack knew no English and didn't begin learning until he was 6 and already in school. Gerard and Jack, despite the age difference, got along well together, Gerard taking his role as eldest sibling seriously, even at his young age. In later years, in his 40s, Jack recalled how Gerard used to take him outside, and the two would look up at the sky, watching the white clouds go by, counting them one by one. In other instances, Gerard went for walks and took Jack along, always making sure the younger brother held his hand so he wouldn't get lost. But the biggest lessons Gerard taught him, Jack said, were to be kind to animals, something he took to heart, being a great animal lover throughout his life, and to remember God in whatever he did. How much the younger brother understood, being only 4, is hard to guess, but it is clear Gerard had a great impact on him throughout his life, including in his writing. While these happy memories stayed with Jack, the most important and gut-wrenching memories were of Gerard's final years, years filled with pain and agony, with little relief in between. As mentioned, the eldest Kerouac child was born sickly, and as he grew older, his illnesses multiplied and grew. When he was 9, in 1926, Gerard contracted rheumatic fever, his heart, joints, skin, and nerves becoming inflamed. Now, a relatively minor medical condition, but back in 1926, especially for a poor family just trying to get by, as the Kerouacs were, rheumatic fever was a serious issue, and Gerard, always dealing with minor discomfort, began experiencing horrible pain. Tended to by Gabrielle night and day, with help from the Sisters of St. Louis de France, the nuns who ran the parochial school the boy attended, Gerard slowly wasted away until barely anything was left of his little body. During the final hours of his life, on June 2, 1926, Gerard, according to Gabrielle and the sisters, received a vision of the Virgin Mary. She appeared above his bed, the boy telling his mother and the nuns, who prayed and wept at his bedside. Finally, his heart gave out, and Gerard Kerouac passed away. His death, even though he was only 4 when he died, left an impermanent impression on Jack, both spiritually and emotionally. For the remainder of his life, he would believe his elder brother was a saint, holy and pure, and he also felt, sadly, he could never measure up to how good Gerard had been. These feelings weren't helped by Gabrielle, who, most likely unconsciously, kept holding her eldest up as the pinnacle of virtue to her youngest, telling him how he must be as good, as great as Gerard, not meaning to make Jack feel small or flawed in comparison, but leaving the feeling all the same. The death of Gerard also gave Jack anxiety, making him fear sleeping alone for years afterwards, afraid something might happen to him and take him away as well. As a result, as many children do, he resorted to sleeping with his mother for comfort and safety. Without his elder brother, Jack began taking more interest in Nin, the 2 surviving siblings playing together and going to the movies on Saturdays, able to get in to see whichever picture was currently playing thanks to the fact that Leo printed off the programs for the owner, a nice benefit brother and sister made sure to take advantage of often. By 6, Jack was sent to St. Joseph Brothers School, where he was taught by the sisters there, and it was at St. Joseph Brothers where he was introduced to the English language for the first time, and he struggled to understand it. To many who've read Kerouac's works, it may seem hard to believe there was a time he did not know English, given his mastery and use of it was, in this author's opinion, excellent. But his first language was and remained Canadian French, and it took years for Jack to get a grip on English, only feeling comfortable speaking it in his teens, and even as an adult, he felt lacking. never believing he could speak it as well as a native speaker. Throughout Jack's childhood, the family moved about Lowell, moving due to his father's financial troubles, caused both by the Great Depression of the 1930s and Leo's habit of gambling, worsening their money problems. And it left Jack with a feeling of fondness for all of Lowell, never having one place he could remember growing up in completely, but hopping from house to house, neighborhood to neighborhood in search of stability. Things grew worse when Leo, not content with gambling as a coping mechanism, turned to alcohol, spending the few dollars he did make from his business on booze and the track, leaving Gabrielle and the children without much income to buy food, clothing, and other essentials. By the time Tijan was 10, the family moved to Pawtucketville, another French-Canadian neighborhood in Lowell, and it is here, more than any other neighborhood he would live in before or after, that he felt most at home. While in Pawtucket, the children socialized and made friends with local kids, but the parents did not mix much with others. Gabrielle, always the homemaker and caregiver, spent most of her time cooking, cleaning the house, or making sure Jack and Nin did their schoolwork. When not concerned with the home, she found solace in the church, going to Mass regularly, often taking Jack along with her, where the young boy sat transfixed by the sights, sounds, and smell of the rituals, his eyes finding the cross where Jesus lay crucified, the Lamb of God, whose blood was shed for mankind's sins, according to traditional Christianity. The message was powerful, leaving a long-lasting impression on Jack's mind. The figure of Jesus, as man and as the Word of God and God himself, would play a vital role in his life. While he might stray from traditional Catholicism, mixing it with Buddhism as a young man, he never abandoned the Christian faith, keeping Jesus and what the cross symbolized close to his heart. Like many boys his age in his ancestral home of Canada, Jack played hockey in winters on Lowell's frozen streets and on the Merrimack River that flowed behind the city. In the summer, he played the all-American game of baseball, developing a lifelong fascination and love for the sport, which became the basis for his own fantasy baseball league, which he continued to play through his life. But the game Jack came to enjoy most and grew skilled at was football, which he played with his friends George Apostolos, Henry Scuddy Beaulieu, and Jack's best friend throughout his childhood and teenage years, Sebastian Sammy Sampas. In Jack's early teens, Leo, finding extra work at a bowling alley, soon rose to become its manager, and this allowed the Kerouac household to begin to accumulate some much-needed income. And, thankfully, the senior Kerouac was able to curb his drinking and gambling habits, so that, while not altogether eliminated, he was able to resist temptation enough to provide for his wife and children. In one of the lapses back into vice, Leo, deciding to go bet money on the horse races, took the 12-year-old Jack along, both to spend time with him and to get him out of Gabrielle's hair for a while. Jack fell in love with the races, both admiring the speed and agility in the horses themselves and how the betting system worked. Hitting junior high school in 1935, Jack and his friends spent their afternoons, since Gabrielle and Leo were out of the house working and didn't want the boys inside, unsupervised by adults, hanging around a Greek neighborhood called Draycut. Here he played baseball with his friends, walked along its roads looking at the farms and farmers, talking about their teenage worries and problems, discussing their favorite radio shows, movies, and pulp stories. An avid reader of pulp stories, Kerouac bought up the magazines whenever he could, particularly the Shadow magazine. Along with the pulps, Jack enjoyed comic books and the Sunday funnies, a reading taste he shared with Leo. By 13, he had begun writing his own stories, starting off drawing comic strips and filling in the word balloons, before moving on to filling notebooks with short stories and his first attempts at novel writing. Inspired by the pulps, these early stories were fantasies, westerns, and other genres usually covered in the magazines he enjoyed. The biggest event in his teenage years came at 14, when that winter the Merrimack River flooded and the water surged up the banks into Lowell, destroying houses and businesses alike. One of the businesses affected was Leo Kerouac's printing shop, which, while not as lucrative as before, was still part of the family's income. The water seeped through the door and wrecked the equipment, everything needing to be thrown out. The loss of the print shop forced Leo to leave Lowell to search for work, which he thankfully found, and put a dent in the family finances for a while. But this didn't dampen Jack's spirits much.
Discovering his love of writing early, he continued blazing through notebooks, filling them in on impulse. Stories, poetry, comic scripts, he wrote it all. By 16, Kerouac had developed into a handsome young football star on the make, playing for his high school team, winning praise for his skill, and he also fell in love for the very first time.
The girl who caught his attention was Mary Carney, who came from an Irish-American family and was, by all accounts, quite pretty. Jack was, in a word, smitten, and she liked him too. The romance was an on and off again sort of relationship. Jack, dreaming of bigger things beyond Lowell, by now convinced writing was what he wanted to do with his life, wasn't sure being with Mary was the right decision. She was a good person, loving and supportive, but also traditional. For Mary, the ideal life was one of marriage, several children, a stable household, the American dream in a nutshell. And she wanted to stay in Lowell. An understandable and pleasant goal to have, but not one Jack was certain he wanted or could pursue. The two continued dating until high school ended, and Jack, earning 2 football scholarships from Boston College and Columbia University, decided to leave Lowell to pursue higher education. In the end, due in part to his mother's urgings and his desire to study at a prestigious school, Jack chose Columbia. But before he could attend there, he needed to complete a year of prep school at Horace Mann in New York. So, with reluctance, Jack ended things with Mary Carney and packed his bags for the Big Apple, arranging to stay with his mother's stepsister during his year at prep school before moving on to the campus at Columbia. His year at Horace Mann, while he learned a great deal, was also one of embarrassment for him. Many of the students at the school came from wealthy or comfortable families, many of whom were Jews of various European ethnicities, and Jack, while not overtly anti-Semitic like his mother, did harbor some prejudices against Jews, but not enough to prevent him from making friends with individual Jewish people, a current theme throughout his life. While at prep school, Jack began reading more widely, picking up the works of Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great 19th century American essayist and philosopher, and the novelist and naturalist Henry David Thoreau. In fact, Jack was so amazed by Thoreau's descriptions of nature in his novel Walden that he contemplated abandoning college, giving up on society, and heading out into the great American wilderness to live a hermit existence and devote himself to writing. Of course, such flights of fancy did not lead anywhere. He remained at Horace Mann, continued to study, play football, and eat his bread and butter sandwiches for lunch nearly every day, all he had, all the while practicing his writing. He was always writing. In the school's magazine, the Horace Mann Quarterly, Jack had his first published credit. A mystery short story he wrote, called The Brothers, found its way into the magazine's pages in the fall, bringing him a lot of joy seeing his work in print. In addition to writing pieces for the magazine, Kerouac also cut his teeth working as a reporter for the school's newspaper. While he was busy writing fiction and articles for the newspaper, Jack made sure to find time to socialize, pushing his natural shyness aside as best he could in order to do so. One person he met during this period who became a close friend was Seymour Wise, an Englishman who came over to America a few months prior due to his father, rightly believing war was brewing in Europe. Seymour played an influential role in getting Jack into jazz music, something up to now he had little experience with. Wise took Kerouac, very much still a country bumpkin to many at the school, into Harlem, where they sat in bars and jazz joints listening to music and chatting with other patrons. One band Kerouac enjoyed at this time was the Count Basie Band, led by William James Count Basie, a black pianist, composer, and organist from New Jersey. The sound of jazz hooked Jack, who was amazed at the sound, cadence, and rhythm of it all. It was here, among the bars and people of Harlem, where the seeds were planted for his later lyrical style, taking inspiration from jazz and musicians like Count Basie, Roy Eldridge, and others. Doing well in both football and grades, Jack graduated from Horace Mann in 1940 and went on to Columbia University, where he looked forward to making a name for himself playing football and focusing on writing. However, as life happens sometimes, things didn't go according to Jack's plan.